On the morning of January 18, 1701, courtiers at Versailles whispered nervously as the doors to the royal apartments creaked open. Inside, King Louis Roman, 14 of France, then 62 years old and already the most powerful monarch in Europe, began another day governed not just by state affairs, but by rituals so rigid and personal that the machinery of government itself bent around them. This was the Sun King, ruler of more than 20 million subjects, and his habits were as absolute as his authority. In early modern Europe, the private lives of monarchs were never truly private. Their bodies, preferences, and peculiarities became extensions of the state. To understand their habits is to understand how power functioned in an age when a king's personal routine could shape politics, culture, and even history itself. This story examines 11 monarchs whose habits went far beyond mere eccentricity. Their behaviors shocked contemporaries, altered court life, and in some cases reshaped entire nations. These were not rumors whispered centuries later. Many of these habits were recorded by courtiers, diplomats, physicians, and historians who witnessed them firsthand. In this first section, we begin with 3 rulers whose bizarre routines reveal how personal obsession and absolute power could merge into something extraordinary and sometimes destructive. Louis Roman, 14 of France, reigned from 1043 to 1715, one of the longest reigns in European history. From the moment he assumed full power in 1661, Louis transformed his daily life into a public spectacle. His most infamous habit was turning his morning routine into a political ceremony. The king's waking, known as the lever, was attended by carefully ranked nobles who competed fiercely for the honor of handing him his shirt or watching him dress. What might seem trivial was in fact a calculated system. By forcing the nobility to revolve around his most intimate moments, Louis neutralized their political independence. Attendance at the lever became a symbol of favor. Exclusion meant disgrace. Louis's habits extended beyond ceremony into obsessive control of his environment. He reportedly changed outfits multiple times a day, not for comfort but to project perpetual grandeur. His obsession with cleanliness, at least by 17th century standards, was unusual for the era, yet it came paired with contradictions. While he demanded elaborate perfumes and frequent changes of linen, he feared bathing, believing it weakened the body. His doctors reinforced this belief, prescribing purges, enemas, and bloodletting instead. These treatments became habitual. Over the course of his life, Louis endured thousands of enemas, a practice that shocked foreign visitors but was normalized within his court. The consequences of Louis Roman XIV's habits were immense. His ritualized court life drained the treasury, drew nobles away from their estates, and centralized power in Versailles. France became the cultural model for Europe, but the financial strain contributed to the economic crises that later fueled revolution. What began as personal routine became national policy. Nearly 3 centuries earlier, in late 15th century England, another monarch's habits unsettled his court in a very different way. King Henry VI, born in 1421 and crowned king at just 9 months old, grew into a man whose behavior baffled and frightened those around him. By August 1453, during the height of the 100 Years' War, Henry suffered what contemporaries described as a complete mental collapse. For over a year, the king was unable to speak, recognize his own family, or respond to events around him. When his son Edward was born in October 1453, Henry reportedly showed no awareness of the child. This was not a single episode but part of a broader pattern. Henry's habits during lucid periods were marked by extreme piety and withdrawal. He avoided conflict, disliked loud noise, and preferred long hours of silent prayer. While devotion was expected of medieval kings, Henry's behavior went far beyond the norm. He founded religious colleges and spent lavishly on ecclesiastical projects while neglecting military and political leadership. The consequences were catastrophic. Henry's inability to rule created a power vacuum filled by rival nobles, most notably Richard, Duke of York. The result was the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that tore England apart for decades. Henry's personal habits, rooted in psychological fragility and religious obsession, became a national crisis. His reign demonstrates how a monarch's inner world could destabilize an entire kingdom. While Henry VI withdrew from the world, Tsar Peter I of Russia, later known as Peter the Great, plunged into it with manic intensity. Born in 1672, Peter became co-ruler in 1682 and sole ruler by 1696. His habits were legendary even in his own lifetime. Unlike most monarchs, Peter despised traditional court etiquette. He preferred manual labor, practical skills, and constant motion. He was known to work as a shipwright, carpenter, and blacksmith, often for hours at a time, even while ruling a vast empire. Peter's most infamous habit was his obsession with forcing modernization through personal example and coercion. In September 1698, after returning from his travels in Western Europe, Peter personally took scissors to the beards of his nobles. In Russia, beards were symbols of religious and cultural identity. Peter viewed them as backward. Those who refused to shave were taxed heavily and forced to carry tokens proving payment. The act of shaving became a political statement enforced by the Tsar's own hand. His habits also included extreme physical energy paired with sudden violent outbursts. Peter suffered from facial tics and seizures, likely linked to neurological conditions. During episodes of rage, he could become brutally aggressive. Historical accounts describe him beating servants and officials, sometimes fatally. These were not hidden incidents. They were known at court and feared. Yet Peter's habits also reshaped Russia. His relentless drive led to the creation of a modern navy, the founding of St. Petersburg in 1703, and sweeping administrative reforms. Russia emerged as a European power, but at enormous human cost. Thousands died building the new capital. Peter's personal obsessions became national transformation, illustrating how bizarre habits could coexist with historical achievement. These three monarchs lived in different centuries and cultures, yet they shared a crucial trait. Their personal habits were inseparable from their rule. In a world where kings were seen as divinely appointed, every action carried symbolic weight. Whether through ritualized control, debilitating withdrawal, or obsessive reform, these rulers shaped history not only through wars and laws, but through the strange rhythms of their daily lives. On April 23, 1558, as dawn broke over the palace of El Escorial near Madrid, servants moved cautiously through the corridors, careful not to disturb a king whose habits had become both legendary and terrifying. Philip Roman, II of Spain, ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen, governed lands stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, yet behind the image of a pious Catholic monarch lay a man whose private routines revealed a profound obsession with control, death, and ritualized suffering. Like many rulers of his age, Philip believed his personal discipline reflected divine order. Unlike most, he carried that belief into realms few dared to follow. Philip Roman II ruled from 1556 to 1598, and his habits were shaped by deep religiosity and chronic ill health. He lived much of his life in physical pain, suffering from gout so severe he was often unable to walk. Rather than seeking comfort, Philip treated pain as a spiritual exercise. He slept little, worked excessively, and surrounded himself with reminders of mortality. His most notorious habit emerged near the end of his life. In the 1590s, as his health deteriorated, Philip ordered that the coffin of his deceased wife, Queen Isabella of Portugal, be opened and placed near his bed. Contemporary accounts describe the king spending hours contemplating her remains, convinced that meditating on death would bring him closer to God. This fixation on decay was not morbid curiosity alone. It influenced governance. Philip delayed decisions endlessly, reading and rereading reports, convinced that careful suffering led to righteous outcomes. His hesitation crippled Spanish administration. Military responses were slow, rebellions smoldered, and the vast bureaucracy became paralyzed. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not caused by his habits alone, but his inability to act decisively contributed to Spain's gradual decline. His personal rituals of suffering became national stagnation. Across the Channel in early 18th century Britain, another monarch's habits baffled courtiers for entirely different reasons. Queen Anne, who reigned from 1702 to 1714, was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. By the time she ascended the throne, Anne was already plagued by illness. She suffered from gout, poor eyesight, and recurring fevers. Over the course of her life, she experienced at least 17 pregnancies, none of which produced a surviving heir. This tragic pattern shaped her habits and her reign. Anne developed an intense emotional dependence on her close companions, particularly Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and later Abigail Masham. Her habit of elevating personal favorites to positions of immense influence destabilized the court. Political decisions became intertwined with private affections. Ministers rose and fell based on Anne's shifting emotional attachments. Letters from the period reveal a queen who sought comfort and validation in relationships that replaced the children she never had. Her physical habits also drew attention. Anne struggled with mobility and was often carried in a sedan chair. She ate heavily, a practice encouraged by physicians of the time, leading to significant weight gain. While not outrageous by modern standards, these habits became symbols of weakness to political rivals. The Queen's reliance on others allowed factions to manipulate policy during the War of the Spanish Succession. Her reign ended with the Act of Union in 1707, uniting England and Scotland into Great Britain, but her personal vulnerabilities left the monarchy exposed. Anne's habits mattered because they highlighted the fragile boundary between private grief and public power. In the Ottoman Empire during the late 16th century, Sultan Murad Roman III exhibited habits that shocked even a court accustomed to luxury and excess. Murad ruled from 1574 to 1595, presiding over a vast empire at its territorial peak. Unlike warrior sultans before him, Murad rarely led armies. Instead, he withdrew into the imperial harem, where his personal habits reached extraordinary extremes. Murad's most documented obsession was his sexual compulsiveness. Court records and diplomatic reports suggest he fathered more than 100 children, though the exact number remains uncertain. His nights were governed by ritualized encounters arranged by palace officials whose sole task was to satisfy the Sultan's desires. This was not mere indulgence. In the Ottoman system, producing heirs was a political necessity, but Murad's excess destabilized succession. The overcrowded imperial family intensified rivalries that later erupted into fratricidal violence. Murad was also deeply superstitious. He consulted astrologers obsessively, timing decisions based on celestial signs. Military campaigns, appointments, and even executions were delayed or advanced according to horoscopes. This habit undermined administrative efficiency. As corruption spread, provincial governors acted independently, weakening central authority. Murad's personal retreat into pleasure and superstition marked the beginning of a long decline in Ottoman governance. His habits mattered because they shifted the empire away from disciplined expansion toward internal decay. In Qing dynasty, China, Emperor Zheng, who ruled from 1505 to 1500, 121, shocked Confucian officials with habits that openly rejected imperial norms. Born Zhu Huzhao, Zheng ascended the throne at 14. Almost immediately, he displayed disdain for scholarship, ritual, and moral restraint. He preferred adventure, disguise, and spectacle. Rather than residing in the Forbidden City, he often slipped out dressed as a commoner, roaming Beijing's markets and taverns. Zheng's most infamous habit was role-playing. He built an elaborate complex within the palace known as the Leopard House, where he staged mock battles, hunts, and theatrical performances. He appointed favorites with no administrative experience to high positions, basing decisions on amusement rather than merit. One such favorite, Liu Jin, gained immense power and became notorious for corruption before being executed after Zheng's death. The emperor's obsession with personal freedom extended to foreign affairs. He led a campaign against Mongol forces, not out of strategic necessity, but for excitement. While he achieved some success, his recklessness alarmed officials. Zheng drowned in 1521 after falling from a boat during one of his expeditions, ending a reign defined by indulgence. His habits weakened central authority and emboldened eunuchs, reshaping the balance of power within the Ming court. In Russia, nearly 2 centuries after Peter the Great, Tsar Paul, I ruled from 1796 to 1001, and became infamous for habits that bordered on obsessional paranoia. Paul inherited a throne shaped by his mother, Catherine the Great, whom he deeply resented. His habits reflected a desperate need for control and validation. He rewrote military regulations obsessively, altering uniforms, drills, and punishments in minute detail. Soldiers were flogged for improperly fastened buttons. Paul's daily routine was rigid to the point of absurdity. He demanded absolute silence at specific hours and punished courtiers for trivial infractions. His fixation on order was paired with erratic decision-making. One day he would grant favors, the next revoke them violently. His distrust extended to his own family. He confined his sons, fearing betrayal. These habits created an atmosphere of fear that culminated in his assassination on March 23, 1801. Conspirators, including senior officers, justified their actions as necessary for national stability. Paul's reign demonstrated how personal paranoia could become political terror. His habits mattered because they showed how unchecked autocracy could implode from within. By the early 19th century, monarchy was no longer unquestioned, but personal habits still carried immense symbolic weight. These rulers, from Spain to China, governed empires while trapped in private obsessions. Their routines shaped policy, destabilized courts, and altered history. In the next section, we will examine monarchs whose bizarre habits pushed the boundaries of identity, appearance, and reality itself. On the night of December 26, 1791, as snow settled quietly over Vienna, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph Roman II lay dying in a sparsely furnished room. Unlike generations of Habsburg rulers before him, Joseph had rejected ceremonial splendor almost entirely. His habits in life, as in death, shocked Europe not through indulgence, but through relentless austerity and ideological obsession. Joseph Roman, too, believed that monarchy should be rational, efficient, and stripped of mystery. Yet this conviction itself became a kind of fixation, one that alienated allies, destabilized his empire, and revealed how even reformist habits could turn bizarre when pursued without restraint. Joseph Roman II ruled from 1765 as co-ruler and from 1780 as sole emperor until his death in 1790. He slept on a simple bed, dressed plainly, and traveled incognito to observe his subjects. His most notorious habit was micromanagement on an almost pathological scale. He issued more than 6,000 decrees in just 10 years, regulating everything from burial practices to monastery life. One of his strangest reforms banned traditional coffins, ordering reusable burial sacks instead, believing this more hygienic and economical. The public reaction was outrage. Funeral rituals, deeply tied to religious belief, were suddenly reduced to state efficiency. Joseph's obsession with rational reform extended to religion. He closed hundreds of monasteries he deemed unproductive, redirecting their wealth to state-controlled charities. While motivated by Enlightenment ideals, his habits ignored local traditions and emotional realities. Riots broke out in the Austrian Netherlands and Hungary. By the end of his reign, Joseph was forced to revoke many reforms. His habits mattered because they demonstrated that even well-intentioned personal obsessions could fracture empires when imposed without empathy. While Joseph Roman II rejected luxury, Ludwig Roman II of Bavaria embraced fantasy with breathtaking intensity. Born in 1845, Ludwig ascended the throne in 1864 at just 18. By the 1870s, his habits had transformed him into one of history's most enigmatic monarchs. Ludwig was obsessed with medieval romance, opera, and imagined pasts. He withdrew almost entirely from political life, delegating governance while he retreated into dreamlike isolation. Ludwig's most famous habit was his nocturnal lifestyle. He slept during the day and conducted his private world at night, riding alone through forests or dining in elaborate halls illuminated only by candlelight. He commissioned fantastical castles such as Neuschwanstein, built not for defense or administration, but for personal immersion in myth. These castles drained Bavaria's finances, alarming ministers who found the king increasingly detached from reality. His habits extended into personal interactions. Ludwig avoided physical contact, rarely appeared in public, and communicated with servants through written notes to avoid conversation. He maintained imaginary courts, dining alone while servants acted as silent witnesses to non-existent guests. By 1886, the Bavarian government declared him mentally unfit. He was deposed and placed under supervision. Days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg under mysterious circumstances. The consequences of Ludwig's habits were profound. Bavaria lost effective leadership during a critical period of German unification. His castles, once symbols of excess, later became cultural icons, reshaping Germany's global image. Ludwig's life shows how escapism, when backed by absolute power, could become historical legacy. In France, during the mid-16th century, King Charles VI displayed habits that terrified his court and confounded physicians. Born in 1368, Charles ascended the throne at 11. Initially capable, he began suffering from severe mental disturbances by 1392. His most bizarre habit involved episodes in which he believed himself to be made of glass. During these periods, Charles refused to be touched, fearing he would shatter. He wore reinforced clothing and demanded iron rods be sewn into his garments for protection. These episodes were not fleeting delusions. They recurred throughout his life, accompanied by violent outbursts in which Charles attacked courtiers, sometimes killing them. Between episodes, he appeared lucid, making his condition unpredictable and deeply unsettling. The court developed routines to manage the king's habits, removing sharp objects and controlling access to him. Charles's illness had devastating political consequences. With the king incapacitated, power shifted to rival factions, notably the Burgundians and Armagnacs. France descended into civil war during the later stages of the 100 Years' War, weakening resistance against England. Charles's habits, rooted in psychological illness, became a national tragedy. They mattered because they exposed the vulnerability of hereditary monarchy to personal instability. In the late 18th century, King Christian Roman VII of Denmark exhibited habits that scandalized Europe and altered Scandinavian politics. Born in 1749, Christian ascended the throne at 17. Almost immediately, signs of severe mental illness appeared. He suffered from hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme mood swings. His habits included self-harm, public indecency, and erratic behavior that made him unfit to rule. Christian's condition created a vacuum filled by his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee exploited the king's dependence, effectively ruling Denmark from 1770 to 1772. He introduced radical Enlightenment reforms, abolishing torture and censorship. While progressive, these changes were imposed rapidly, provoking backlash. Christian's inability to understand or control events allowed court conspiracies to flourish. In 1772, Struensee was arrested and executed, and Christian was sidelined for the remainder of his life. Denmark entered a period of conservative retrenchment. Christian's habits mattered because they demonstrated how mental illness at the center of power could enable both reform and reaction, reshaping a nation's trajectory. Across the Atlantic in early 19th century Mexico, Emperor Agustin I exhibited habits that revealed the fragility of newly formed monarchies. Crowned in 1008, 122 after leading Mexico's independence from Spain, Agustin lacked centuries of royal tradition to restrain him. His habits reflected insecurity and improvisation. He obsessed over symbols of legitimacy, demanding elaborate ceremonies, new titles, and constant displays of loyalty. Agustin's daily routine was marked by suspicion. He monitored officials closely, imprisoned critics, and dissolved Congress when challenged. His fixation on personal authority alienated former allies. Within a year, military leaders revolted. In March 1008, 123, Agustin abdicated and went into exile. His brief reign shows how habits formed under pressure can become destructive. Without institutional limits, Agustin's personal insecurities became political collapse. His story matters because it illustrates how bizarre habits are not confined to ancient or absolute monarchies, but can emerge wherever power concentrates around one individual. These monarchs differed in temperament, culture, and era, yet their habits shared a common thread. Each ruler allowed personal routines, beliefs, or obsessions to override balance and restraint. Whether driven by reform, fantasy, illness, or insecurity, their behaviors reshaped states and lives beyond themselves. In the final section, we will examine the last group of monarchs whose bizarre habits blurred the line between performance and reality, leaving legacies that still provoke debate today. On the evening of August 30, 1797, in the candlelit chambers of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Empress Catherine Roman, II of Russia, dictated letters long into the night, her pen moving as relentlessly as her ambition. Known to history as Catherine the Great, she ruled from 1762 until her death in 1796 and transformed Russia into a major European power. Yet alongside her political achievements grew rumors, habits, and behaviors that fascinated contemporaries and later generations alike. Catherine's private routines, though often exaggerated by enemies, reveal how closely a monarch's personal life could become entangled with political narrative, reputation, and power itself. Catherine's most discussed habit was her reliance on a succession of favorites. These were not merely lovers, but political companions who received titles, estates, and influence. Catherine believed emotional fulfillment was essential to effective rule, a belief uncommon for female rulers of her era. Her relationships were carefully managed. When one favorite fell from grace, another was elevated, often with generous pensions to prevent resentment. While scandalous to outsiders, this habit stabilized her court by preventing the rise of a single dominant faction. The consequences were complex. Catherine's personal habits fed hostile propaganda, particularly in revolutionary France, where she was portrayed as immoral and decadent. Yet domestically, her reign brought administrative reform, territorial expansion, and cultural patronage. Her habits mattered not because they weakened Russia, but because they demonstrated how personal autonomy in a ruler could be weaponized by rivals to shape historical memory. In stark contrast stood King George Roman III of Great Britain, whose habits reflected inner turmoil rather than indulgence. Born in 1738, George ruled from 1760 to 1820, one of the longest reigns in British history. During his lifetime, he suffered recurrent episodes of mental illness, now widely believed to be bipolar disorder or porphyria. His habits during these episodes were alarming. He spoke incessantly for hours, repeated phrases compulsively, and wrote letters without pause. Witnesses described him foaming at the mouth and restraining himself physically to avoid harming others. These behaviors were not hidden. By the late 1780s, Parliament openly debated the king's condition. His habits directly led to the Regency crisis of 1788, when lawmakers considered transferring power to his son. Though George recovered temporarily, his final descent after 1810 rendered him permanently incapacitated. The Regency Act of 1811 formalized the transfer of power. George Roman III's habits mattered profoundly. They accelerated constitutional change, reducing the monarch's direct authority and strengthening parliamentary governance. His personal instability became a catalyst for modern British constitutional monarchy, showing how private affliction could reshape public systems. Further south in Europe, King Ferdinand Roman VII of Spain embodied habits rooted in cruelty and distrust. Born in 1784, Ferdinand reclaimed the throne in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat. Rather than embracing reform, Ferdinand developed a habit of obsessive retribution. He revoked the liberal constitution of 1812, imprisoned former allies, and reinstated the Inquisition. His daily routine involved reviewing denunciations and signing orders of arrest. Ferdinand's paranoia extended to family and advisors alike. He changed ministers frequently, fearing conspiracies everywhere. This habit paralyzed governance and fueled rebellion. Spanish colonies in the Americas, already unstable, seized the opportunity to declare independence. By the time Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain had lost most of its empire. His habits mattered because they transformed fear into policy. Ferdinand's personal vendettas accelerated imperial collapse and left Spain politically fractured for decades. In Asia during the late 19th century, Emperor Tongzhai of Qing China displayed habits that symbolized the decay of imperial authority. Born in 1856, Tongzhai ascended the throne at 5 years old, with real power exercised by regents, including the Empress Dowager Cixi. As he reached adolescence, Tongzhai rebelled against confinement and ritual. His habits included nightly excursions to Beijing's entertainment districts, excessive drinking, and neglect of imperial duties. Court officials attempted to conceal his behavior, but rumors spread rapidly. His health deteriorated, likely from illness exacerbated by exhaustion and excess. He died in 1875 at just 19. Tongzhai's habits mattered not for their shock value alone, but because they exposed the inability of the king's system to adapt. His reign highlighted generational alienation within the imperial family, accelerating loss of legitimacy as China faced internal rebellion and foreign pressure. Finally, we return to ancient Rome, where Emperor Caligula, born in 12 AD and ruling from 37 to 41 AD, embodied the most extreme convergence of power and personal excess. Ancient sources such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe habits so outrageous they blur into legend. Yet enough corroboration exists to confirm a pattern of erratic behavior. Caligula demanded worship as a living god, built temples to himself, and reportedly conversed with the moon. He dressed as gods and goddesses, changing identities daily. His habits extended into governance. He appointed his horse Incitatus to a ceremonial position, not as a joke, but as a deliberate humiliation of the Senate. He ordered extravagant construction projects, drained the treasury, and imposed arbitrary taxes. His unpredictability created an atmosphere of terror. Senators never knew whether praise or silence would provoke execution. Caligula's reign ended violently in January 41 AD when members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him. His habits mattered because they revealed the limits of absolute power. Rome survived him, but his reign became a cautionary tale used for centuries to justify restraints on imperial authority. Across 4,000 years of history, these 11 monarchs demonstrate a consistent truth. When power concentrates in one individual, personal habits become political forces. Rituals can centralize authority, obsessions can paralyze empires, fantasies can drain treasuries, and illness can reshape constitutions. These rulers were not merely odd individuals. They were products of systems that magnified human behavior to world-changing scale. Understanding their habits does more than satisfy curiosity. It reveals how history is shaped not only by wars and treaties, but by sleep patterns, fears, fixations, and routines carried out behind palace doors. Monarchies rose and fell not just on battlefields, but in bedrooms, chapels, and private chambers, where personal habits quietly altered the course of nations.